I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello and welcome to the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast. I'm your host, Antonio, here with, I almost said co-host, but that's not the show that we're doing tonight. My good friend and co-host of another podcast, Justin Henson of the Movie Wire, who is also, like I said, my co-host of Back to the Balcony, our Siskel and Ebert podcast, is on the show to do what we did last year during Animation April, and that's talk about traumatic Toons. So, Justin, how you doing?
I'm doing great. And out of habit, watching both of these movies, I had to look at the Siskel and Ebert reviews, and I got halfway through my analysis on it. I'm like, crap, I'm doing the Cultworthy.
It's a different show.
Different show. So, but I'm great. Thanks for having me back onto the Cult. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, taking a little break from our recording schedule of the other one, which is nice. I feel like we've got a good groove going on we have a good discourse episode, and then we have an episode where we're like, what are these guys talking about? This movie's fantastic. And it is nice to take 1 week off of that show and go back to where we first started talking about cult-worthy cinema. And let's talk really fast about last year's Animation April. We did Fella Day, we did Last Unicorn, we did Fire and Ice, and then we did Rock and Rule. 4 very obscure animated films that all have a lot of adult themes and traumatic elements. And essentially, if you're too young, they're going to give you some really bad vibes, some nightmares maybe, the animation, the style, the storytelling. And we're only doing 2 films this year for Animation April, 2 very different films. But what I think is going to be the interesting part of this conversation is that these really were focused on children more than the ones that we talked about last year were. And in some ways, they're either more disturbing or just more uncomfortable in today's mindset, in today's, let's say, politically correct standards. But we'll get into that. So my first question for you is, I know one of the films that we're talking about we grew up with, but the other one I'm not so sure. So did you see The Adventures of Mark Twain as a kid, or is this something you discovered later in life?
No, I remember seeing this on TV at one point. How much I remember from it? Not a lot. Because as a kid, there's a lot to that movie that would be hard for a kid to totally grasp. But as a rewatch as an adult, and I'm glad you brought it to the table because I haven't taken a watch of this movie since then. And it is a deep movie and it's a beautiful movie, and we're going to jump into it, but it's a great pick.
And see, that's the thing is I had a movie night the other night. I had a little monthly cult movie club, and a bunch of the people I had there, they're my age or older. They'd never heard of it, never seen it. So I went and got the trailer on YouTube, had them watch it, and they could not believe that they had not caught this in the mid 80s when it came out. We'll get to that later. The first one we're bringing to the table, I saw in the theater, and it's a childhood favorite. And I got to ask you too, man. We're talking about The Chipmunk Adventure from 1987. What I didn't realize is how hard it is to see this movie right now. Lucky for me, I've had the DVD for 20 years that even had the little CD of the soundtrack in it as well. But when I try to find it on streaming and try to find it anywhere online, even in the bowels of the internet, I couldn't find it. It had been scrubbed from the internet. So how did you get to watch it?
Well, I do have a DVD copy, but I bought this a long time ago when it hit streaming. And since then, it's been taken down, that streaming platform, but I still have my copy that is
Nice.
still on my library. So it is hard to find. And what I found I was having internet issues the other day and it wouldn't play. I went back to see on IMDb, all right, where else can I watch it? And it's nowhere.
It's
So
nowhere.
it's a shocker to me because the Chipmunks were huge and they're huge still now. There's still a TV show with it. So it baffles me a little bit that this isn't readily available.
Like retro wise, people still listen to the Chipmunk Christmas album, the one from the 60s. You can still find syndication of Alvin and the Chipmunks from the early 80s. This thing had 3 or 4 theatrical films in the mid to late 2000s and new animated series coming up all the time. Like Alvin and the Chipmunks has not really gone away. And much like the Chuck E. Cheese mouse, it keeps developing with time. They keep, restructuring the costumes and the style and the swagger of these to make them more modern and relevant to the time. But it did get a motion picture in 1987. And I remember seeing it in the theater maybe a few times. And I had the VHS as a kid, and it played regularly on TV. The songs were great. I remember people singing the songs when I was younger. But then, I didn't watch it for years. And then when I had my kid, I remembered I had the DVD somewhere, and I showed it to him when he was 8 or 9 years old. And I was like, oh my God, there are so many themes in this film that are probably not very appropriate for kids, but we were unfazed by it in our youth. And we'll get to that in a second. On the second watch of yours, man, how did you feel about the movie?
This is one that I've watched at least once a year. This movie, again, the more you watch it, the more it becomes apparent of how
Yeah.
many adult themes is in this movie.
Yeah.
And when I approach anybody on a pod conversation and I bring up Alvin and the Chipmunks or the Chipmunk Adventure, they don't get it. They just see it at face value of the chipmunks in balloons traveling the world. But when you pay attention to this movie, there is some things that I kind of treasure about it that do make it a little traumatic, not just for the kid element, but for the adult element as well. But there's a lot to this movie that does have a big question mark on what the filmmakers were trying to do. I have my thesis on it of this is what movies for kids and adults should be without progressive humor, without fart jokes. This is one of those movies that does try and appease both sides of the family. And it does go borderline a little bit. And we're going to get into it, I'm sure. But this is a prime example of taking that awesome popular IP at the time and just having a family film that does push the boundaries a little bit.
I remember as a kid being very intrigued by the amount of danger and peril that our characters are put into that you didn't see in the animated series. There's a lot of that. And I think that really goes into play with animated series versus animated movies. One of the ones I almost brought to the table last year was Care Bears the Movie 2. That movie is dark as hell, and it's creepy and scary as hell. It's essentially about a possessed kid. It's essentially about demonology, right? But when you watched the Care Bears TV show, it had nothing to do with that. It was about love and Care Bears stare and harmony and brotherhood. And then you watch this movie about this kid who literally gets possessed. This kind of falls into that same category. There weren't any episodes of Alvin and the Chipmunks where they were in constant peril or about to be murdered by jewel thieves. Yet that is the theme of this movie. So let's go ahead and kind of jump into the plot really fast. So Dave Seville, who is the father figure of these chipmunks, who was based on the guy that created the chipmunks, Ross Bagdasarian. This movie was written, produced, and essentially directed by his son, who took over the property after his dad died. Dave is like the character that would play the piano so the chipmunks could sing back on the albums, and then he was a prominent character in the show. And in this one, he's going off to Europe, assumed for a business trip. I think he wrote jingles is what it was in the TV show. So he's probably off to go write some jingles for some European companies. And Mrs. Miller, the babysitter, who's also the matron of the Chipettes, are watching after the boys. And Alvin, of course, is causing trouble. He wants to go to Europe, and Dave doesn't let him. But then they go to an ice cream parlor, and they're playing a video game. And I always thought it was so funny that the main villains of this movie, the Fursteins, they are hanging out in a kid's ice cream parlor, smoking cigarettes and talking about jewel thievery. I always thought that was a little bit weird, but I kind of dig it now because it just adds to the sinister feeling that this movie presents. Because let's face it, these characters are frightening, right?
They are. And keep in mind, it's the 80s. Everybody smoked everywhere. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
But
it's Baskin Robbins. Who cares? Light them up.
Whatever. But yeah, these characters are a big contrast difference from their voice to the character design. They just scream just pure creepiness and evil, especially when they're interacting with the chipmunks. That just today would be heightened as even more creepy than what we would see it back in the 80s. So I think the character design for these two are a brilliant contrast. And what I really enjoyed about the character design is you take all the villains and then you have the mystery characters on the other side that are following the chipmunks. These characters are all designed very mysterious. They're designed very unique to really heighten that mystery of who these characters are and what the intent of what's going to be the outcome from our villains to the chipmunks. So there's a lot with these human character designs that really forte in the film when we take a look at Dave Seville and Miss Miller. So they're completely different, and there's an intent for that. So we're paying attention, and the kids are paying attention to these creepy figures.
The other thing I didn't notice before is, we are upping our game animation wise from the TV show, because a lot of those animated movies that were based off of a Saturday morning cartoon or whatever were essentially the same animators of the TV show, and it was just an elongated version of that. They didn't really enhance the amount of quality of the animation. This one's different, though. This is a different coat of paint. Like, they really try to make the cinematic quality of this film shine through. And it shows in the animation of not just the amazing backgrounds and, locations all over the world they're going to. It even changes the appearances of our main characters. So for one, the chipmunks in this movie all have colored eyes, where in the TV show they really didn't. They have very bright blue, green, hazel eyes, and it adds more of like an anima, a life force to these characters. And then the humans, Miss Miller and Dave were in the animated series, but in this, they're animated more realistically. They look more like actual people and less like cartoons. But what I love about the dynamic of the heroes and the villains is the hero characters have more rounded features and fleshed out tones, while the villains and mysterious people have very sharp angular features, almost like out of an old Dick Tracy comic book, right? And they're shaded differently. Like their flesh tones are more gray and they're more lifeless. They almost look like they could be otherworldly. And again, that adds to the sinister tone of the film too, because these kids should not trust them. We're looking at them and we don't trust them. And of course, the voices of reason, Simon, he kind of smells it out right away, but Alvin seeks adventure and he gets them signed up to do this race around the world where they're going to be exchanging dolls full of diamonds for dolls full of cash. And that's how these diamond thieves are going to get their plan across and launder this money essentially under the nose of the Interpol, which shows up later. But yeah, that's the other thing too, is these are rich villainous characters voiced by Susan Tyrrell, which I did not realize until I rewatched it and looked it up. I was like, Susan Tyrrell is the voice of the main villainess? How did I not know that? I've been watching her in movies like Angel and Forbidden Zone my entire life, and I didn't realize that she was in this movie. And it was one of her last performances too. And yeah, perfect casting for that. But yeah, the villainous characters, man, they really make this movie something different.
Well, that's the beauty and the brilliance of this because I know this movie took on a lot of animators from Disney after the Black
Yeah.
Cauldron. And you can tell where the talent was kind of spread out on the character design. But the intent, and this is where it's smart writing and smart filmmaking, is because they know they're making a kids movie. 80s animated features, they're a little bit darker on the tone, but they make this a little bit more amplified just to make sure that the kids can follow along with these villains to really separate the heroes and the villains, but at the same time give the adults something to really gain our attention, because there has to be in a chipmunk movie a good contrast to not drive parents crazy. There has to be a good serious tone, and they go all in on these voice actors. So with Klaus and Claudia, these two are the Boris and Natasha.
They
These
are. Yeah.
two have a really great balance between the chipmunks. So if we just had another Dave Seville voice to these villains, it wouldn't have been menacing. It wouldn't have been enough to gain an adult's attention, in my opinion, if I were to go back in time. So I think it is smart filmmaking when it comes to the animation aspect of it. And debatable, but there is nothing within the couple of years of this movie that really had the strategy that these filmmakers do. And what was really smart with Janice Carmen is she's all chipmunks. And this must have been a challenge for her because her entire career was directing chipmunk movies, writing chipmunk movies, voicing in them. So her heart lies in chipmunk movies here.
Well, I mean, we have to let the listeners know that they were married, Ross Bagdasarian Jr. and her. This was an independent production, and that's the other thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that um, the studios that wanted to do it for them wanted more creative control than they were willing to give up. So they essentially self-financed this and then had a studio, I think it was Touchstone, someone put it out. And that is why I feel this movie takes risks with its animation style, with its storytelling, and with its characterization of, I'm going to say different ethnicities, which we can get into later. They didn't have a studio suit breathing down their neck of saying, you can't show that, you can't do that, that's too scary. And so I feel that's why this movie does feel more mature than other animated IPs of its days, because it actually had its original people who created this stuff behind it. And to add to what you were saying, like all these different animation studios that were taking parts of different scenes, like that was one of the big issues, is that they'd go from studio to studio and divide it up because they didn't have an animation department underneath them. So there are times where maybe it does feel a bit more cartoony than others, but it's fine because the fact that it goes around the world, it really just makes you feel like, okay, well, this is a different country. This country's a little bit more silly. This country's a little bit more serious. But we'll get in that in a second. My question for you is, when we were kids, we didn't really think too much about the ethnic caricatures that this film portrays. And even though I recognize it right away, I don't feel like it was done distastefully or it meant to like offend anybody. It was really done to like enhance the idea of what these cultures were so that kids could understand it. It wasn't out hurting people's feelings. I mean, when we do get to the whatever Amazon tribe at the end that wants to sing Wooly Bully and they speak, I don't know, a really interesting cartoony native tongue, maybe that's a little too past the line for me, but I don't think that it was done with the intention of cruelty. I think it was done with the intention of they're trying to add the variety of cultures and ethnicities in this film, and maybe just didn't have enough research or cultural appreciation to do them justice. Does that take away from the movie for you, or does that just make it feel like a timepiece of when it came out?
Kind of all of the above, because here's my take on it, especially when we get to Mexico for their first drop off, is again, not for 80s. I don't know. Even today, I think, like you said, it's innocent, but here's what I think they do right with it is the focus is on the chipmunks. So you have everybody else as extra. So they're not targeting any individual. They're not targeting any specific culture. They're really just singing a song in Mexico.
They're just in Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, I would be more concerned about a little kid saying, "Check out my hips" during a song than I would what they actually focus around the culture aspect of it. So I think when it escalates a little bit, because yeah, the Wooly Bully, that one would be kind of pushing it to the edge a little bit. But I think everything else in it is done in an innocent intent. And I think they did a smart job on not outdating itself by really focusing on the chipmunks and singing the song and focusing on the music. So, and I think the song's good. The song's catchy. So I think it held up pretty well for the most part.
Speaking of the songs, like I think the songs are a lot of fun. They are kind of forced into the story as most musical numbers in these animated features are, but I mean, I just remember as a kid the boys of rock and roll, the girls of rock and roll that they're singing in Athens in the Acropolis. Like that was a show-stopping moment for sure. And it still like gets me going. I'm like, yeah, I love this song. I love this routine. I love this number. I think that and then the score by Randy Edelman. I mean, he did Ghostbusters 2, which we had already covered on our other show. And it's so funny that you can recognize certain composers just by the little breaks and little bridges that they use in their music. And this one is perfect for the time. I remember there was a moment in time where I knew the score to this movie was in my head, but I couldn't remember what 80s movie it went to because they were all very similar at the time, you know? Like the score for Parenthood, very similar. And then we had this one, and when I finally watched it, I'm like, that's it. That's the interlude that I was thinking of. But it also could be interchangeable with so many of those films of the 80s as well, but it works for this movie. And it really is a piece of its time. It's really kind of iconic, in my opinion.
Yeah, Elderman does a lot of fun stuff. I mean, you start with that little jingle, and then you go into the adventure. It's the music that actually matches. He's one of those composers that really takes a story into consideration when it's the music's playing on screen, and I think it's a great score. And when it comes to just a musical, because you know you've never had me on your show for a musical, and I'm still pissed, but this is gonna be the closest we get to it. Is the music, it is a showstopper song when it comes to the boys of rock and roll. And this is where I think the animation really fortes, because this is the smoothest you will see the animation is when they're interacting, when they're going body to body with each other. I mean,
Right.
the only thing that really holds this out of date for me with that song, even though it's a great song, it relies a lot on the song because the cuts, the transitions are so quick, it's hard to really appreciate that smoothness, the talent that went into creating these great animated scenes of look what I can do with these characters. So I love the song. I love the show stopping song, but I think it relies a little too much on it. But it is one of the best musical numbers. And again, we go into that brilliance of trying to tie in the older generation when taking your kids. Tying in these songs into this movie really gets that engagement from adults as well. Because I think I've listened to this soundtrack over the years more times than I can count. And I cannot stand the Chipmunks when it comes to just listening to songs, but I'll listen to this one. Diamond
Right.
Dolls is one of my favorites of the movie.
Diamond Dolls is a banger. Diamond Dolls is an absolute banger. What I like about this movie with its musical numbers and also its themes is that it does uh, divide very well screen time and attention to both groups, because you just don't have the Chipmunks, you also have the Chipettes, and they kind of are like the synonymous versions of each other. Like Brittany and Alvin are the attention seeking rowdies, right? And then you've got Eleanor, and you've got Theodore, and you've got Jeanette, and you've got Simon. Like they all have the comparisons with each other. There's a sweetness, there's a studiousness, and then there's the adventurous side and the competitive side. And so the Chipettes were really more for like the younger females and younger girls to watch. It gave them an audience too. It was kind of double dipping in its audience where, you know, sometimes you'd say like Disney princess movies are really more focused towards young girls. Yeah, kids, boys will watch them, but girls are more the target audience. I feel this one, where Alvin and the Chipmunks was kind of more of like a boy thing, it does a really good job at playing to both sides and paying attention to what both different groups are looking for in their entertainment. Because the Chipettes, they have some really interesting storylines too. Now, first of all, there's the maternal side where they inherit a penguin, and they want to take care of it, take it back to Antarctica. There's a motherly thing to it. But the one thing that kind of rubbed me a little bit weird this time around is I forgot there's that subplot when they get to, I think it's just the Middle East, and they're almost turned into child brides for the Maharaja. And that scene, first of all, it was a little out there. But then I was like, oh, wow, they're essentially a harem of chipettes for this guy. Like, they're dressed in like little slinky outfits, and they have to do a snake charmer dance. And I'm not saying that like this was supposed to be titillating for anybody, but I don't think you would see that in a cartoon for kids these days without getting some kind of uproar from some kind of groups. But growing up, I never heard of any uproar about this.
Yeah, there really wasn't because the mindset wasn't there.
Right.
As we evolved culturally, yeah, I mean, we have society looking for those different things, and even a rewatch now, it is a bizarre song. It's a bizarre setup, and it's almost cringy now because um, we take a lot of the Chipette scenes and their songs, and it gradually grows to almost a sexism
Yeah.
piece where, yeah, they get into the song "Getting Lucky," which is insanely bizarre. Um, for But then we get into a ballad about singing to their mother. So
Yeah.
it's almost like a teenage rebellion when it comes to it, or regret, because we even get a little bit of that in the and girls of rock and roll, where the chipmunks just run over a trio of priests trying to sing about rock and roll. So it's almost like the midway point goes into like a teenage rebellion and then redemption and being at terms of the things that they've done, subtly. But that is just me over analyzing it. On the surface, this song is really kind of a question mark of really what we talk about, going to that edge of animation, of almost a traumatic thing to see. Because if we look at parents, and there's another scene at the end that we'll talk about really
Right.
quick, but if we talk about parents, this is where the fear and the traumatic thing comes in, is seeing your kids out. You don't know where they're at, and this is where they could be, is just slaves to a king and singing and dancing to
Right.
Getting Lucky. So that is a fear element, and it's something as kids we wouldn't have recognized, but now that we're parents, that is that is a huge fear. That is the biggest fear, especially if you have young daughters living in your house. So to me, that is kind of what really sparked this as a traumatic film for me as a parent.
100%, because the other thing too, which I'm not sure is the part you're going to talk about, is the boys have their situation as well, where they are essentially abducted by a cannibalistic tribe. They're stripped down to essentially like little loincloths, tied up, and they're going to be feasted on by this cannibal tribe. That scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. They get out of it by singing Wooly Bully, but it doesn't change the fact that they were about to be consumed by an Amazonian tribe. Like, the perils and the lengths that this story goes to put these kids in danger, the fact that one's almost put into a life of sex slavery and the other one's going to be consumed by cannibals, and this is a G-rated kids movie from the 80s. Yeah, I remember that definitely having a mark on me, and you forget about it as you get older, and then you revisit as adults, like, maybe I don't want my kid watching this. He'll be fine,
Well, you even get to the airport, and there's this one shot that on the last viewing, I just said that is probably the most money shot right there. That if there was a shot to define traumatic, it would be Dave Seville watching his son yell for help out of the back seat of a car being
Yeah.
carried away.
Yeah.
So that would be the pivotal of, man, that is my worst nightmare right there too.
It's just a very interesting movie, and maybe that's why it's so hard to find now. Like, I looked up to see how much my DVD was worth on Amazon or eBay, and it's like $30-$40. And I think I bought it at a dollar store or something like decades ago. So there's definitely an interest in this movie still. People like you and me have great memories of it, and we want to retain those. And that's where like physical media rules, man, because This thing has literally been scrubbed off the internet. You can find, little commercials and snippets, but even most of the time, I can find something either on Daily Motion or Internet Archive or YouTube where they'll show the film like 20 minutes at a time so it doesn't get taken down. I couldn't even find anything like that. So it's really hard for people to watch this movie and cross compare the way that we did. Lucky for us, we have the physical copies.
And it's one of those things that I hope you're wrong, that the the context of this movie, the material, the some people might find it outdated, and this is what really drives me crazy on what's picked and what's chosen to be up and available. And I really hope it's not because of the subject matter of this, because it's super important for certain elements. Because this movie, oh, I love it. There's a lot of elements to this movie that are positive, and to pick and choose things that might find offensive, it's media's that's almost the current book burning now, is to keep that media just relevant no matter the subject matter, because one, it's not hurting anybody, and two, there are positive messages you can take away from this. And I swear the soundtrack is fantastic by itself just to watch this movie.
Yeah, I mean, you can at least watch the musical numbers on YouTube. Like, that's something. So, yeah, I agree with you 100%. So, yeah, I'd say if you can find it, if you see it at the thrift store, if you see it at the used DVD store, buy it, hold on to it, watch it. It's a piece of animation history. Like, I did not know as much as I do now about how independent of a production this was and how hard they all worked to get this out into theaters, because it almost just got swallowed up by a big studio. All right, so jumping into the next one. This is one of those fever dream animated films that I'm not going to say it was in my category of did I dream this movie, because enough people I know have seen snippets of it or remember nightmarish parts of it from their childhood, but didn't realize it was a feature length film. And that is The Adventures of Mark Twain from 1986. Now, I grew up with this movie. I think the first time I saw it was at school. Someone played it like on a substitute teacher day and scared the shit out of 25 little 6-year-olds watching it during their nap time or something in first or second grade. And then anytime it was on TV, I had to watch it because I like being scared. I loved horror movies as a kid, but it's one of those things where it's like you don't expect to be unnerved and scared and made feel uneasy from claymation cartoon animation. And to even like go further into that, the company that did this was the same company that did the California Raisin commercials of the 1980s, which everybody loved. Everyone knew the cartoon claymation California Raisins, heard it through the grapevine commercials, right? And then you get this animation style, which sadly, no one has, in my opinion, copied or been able to master this kind of quality and detail in claymation. I mean, I love Aardman Studios, but they don't have anything on what these guys did with this one. So I got to ask you now, what was your first experience with this?
You kind of said it. And by the way, the California raisin scared the fuck out of me, just so you know. So this one was one of those on and offs. I know for a fact I didn't watch the whole thing as a kid, and I know I would see snippets growing up. But I think I would remember a movie like this growing up because it is terrifying, especially as a kid. Just the claymation, it's so well done. It's too good when it
It's too
comes
good.
to what it's trying to do,
Right.
and that makes it effective. So I remember certain scenes of this growing up, but again, this is the first time I've actually sat down, watched it end to end, and I watched it twice today to get some pinpoints. And right from the get-go with this animation, that you know you're in for something special, is I have my hats off to anybody that does claymation, because it is hard. It is long, and it is hard to really produce it and get investors to it. But we had the scene where we have Huck Finn, and it spends 10 seconds just focusing on his eyes. That could have taken about a week's worth of work. And just with that pivotal scene in the beginning, you know this is going to be a quality film. You know there's going to be heart in this film on what it's trying to show us, is just by that mere 10 seconds in the beginning of just eyes moving.
Yeah. Eyes moving, their hair, like the attention to detail that they give in their hair. And these aren't human looking animated figures. They are very stylized and enhanced and characterized. But the detail makes it feel like you're actually looking at just some kind of anthropomorphic creature, but you know it's supposed to be a human. It's supposed to be characters we're all familiar with: Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and Becky. And they go onto the coolest proto steampunk airship that Mark Twain himself is going to ride to Halley's Comet. So that part of the story, the opening bit of their stowaways on this airship that Mark Twain is going to take to Halley's Comet because he was born when the comet passed and he plans to die when the comet passes. It introduces you to a concept that you don't really see in its fruition until the last half of the movie, maybe even further, where this isn't just a story about Mark Twain's stories brought to life through claymation. It becomes like this weird, nihilistic and philosophical study of life and death and afterlife and religion and politics and all these different things that you're not supposed to talk about in kids' movies. And instead, they're like, no, we're going to make a feature-length movie about this and pretty much nothing else.
Well, and at this time, I think where this movie failed was nobody knew who it was targeted for, because there
Yeah.
is so
I still don't.
much. Right. But it reminded me, and I love movies like this that really, if it is a kids movie, it's a kids movie to really have them critically think. And there is nothing wrong with having a movie like this for kids to really expand that thought process. I said about The Boy in the Hair, and I love that movie just for that main fact.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a kids movie, but same time, it will expand your imagination. That's what this does. So it's very wordy, it's very Mark Twainy. So, but at the same time, the visuals are there to support it. So you can easily follow along with the visuals, and it does a pretty good job trying to follow along with Twain's wording in his dialogue. So I think when it comes to it, it's for more younger teens, bare minimum. But I think with me, when I'm adult now and I'm thinking back to those scenes that I saw, it's reminiscing with me on what did that really mean. And as an adult, this really does still make me think the most terrifying. It attacks the fear of the what if. Every 15 to 30 minutes, you have that fear of what if come up, and it makes you think until the next scene comes up, and then you're starting again. So I think it's brilliant when it comes to that aspect, where it doesn't just pop scary visuals to you because they know it's naturally creepy, but it does challenge you to really use your imagination to put in that creepiness of, you don't know what this means, or you don't know what comes in the afterlife. You don't know what's behind that door. So I think that's what really makes this terrifying, even more so than the claymation effects.
Well, and the fact that it kind of does a Houdini on you, because
Mm.
it really starts off with, a very funny story about a frog, that someone bets on a frog race and the guy rigs the game and makes the other frog eat a bunch of minor gear and pickaxes and boots and shit so it can't hop. And then it tells this really sweet story that it carries out throughout the whole movie about the diary of Adam and Eve. And it's done so innocently. There's no nudity. Instead, they're wearing like old-fashioned 1910s swimsuits, right? As being naked. And that I remember reading the original story of the Diary of Adam and Eve, and it's really almost word for word of that, where it's Adam and Eve each telling their side of the story of, oh, now there's this woman that showed up and she likes to name things and I like to, do the work and stuff. And it takes them years to finally come together. And then one day a baby appears. How did this baby appear? Like, it's just cute, right? It's innocent. It does tug at the heartstrings, towards the end. Very emotional, almost, tear-jerking moments. And when I say that's the Houdini scene, that is done so, I'm not going to say sanitized, but there's a lot of caution of not making the biblical parable too strong, right? It's almost as if like we don't want to scare people away with our theology with the story of Adam and Eve. But then the mysterious stranger shows up halfway through the movie. And everything that the Diary of Adam and Eve was trying to avoid in its talk of theology, mysterious stranger just throws out all away and essentially paints the picture of humans in the darkest, most sinister, and somewhat, I'm going to say, philosophically brilliant way, where we can't deny what Satan, the character telling the story, we can't deny the relevance and importance of what he's saying, but it's that part that makes us feel icky and traumatized because it makes us ashamed to be human. And this is a cartoon.
The transition, because I love the Adam and Eve, everything about that scene. It's sweet, it's innocent, and again, it's intended to be. Because one, if you're going to sanitize it, you have to go with the evolution of these two on the learning process. And it, God, it almost reminds me of playing The Sims at one point during
Yeah.
this whole thing. So, but then you get into that devil, and the minute we see that scene where we're creating life and then destroying life in the most traumatic way, where it really questions on how things can end really quickly. It really questions a lot of that innocence that or good intentions of what you're trying to do or what you're trying to evolve to, and how quickly our own human selfishness can ruin that. And there's a lot of things that kind of you touched on it, that the guilt is almost a fear itself of humanity, where we fear for what our actions are being and what our actions are going to lead to. And I think in the most vague way, I love the fact that they don't really spell it out to an extent of having us feel that way. But the fact that it naturally comes out that we're feeling that way shows that the writers knew exactly what the feeling they wanted to draw from the audience. And I thought that was something very special and very skilled to do, because watching those scenes go in and we get to the creation of life, I felt like crap. And I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. So, but it's a good emotional effect that they have. It's an emotional roller coaster that really makes you deep dive into oneself.
Well, I mean, the whole monologue that Satan, and first of all, let's describe their perception of Satan. It is a figure who carries a stick, and instead of having a head, it's like a mask on the stick that tells a story, and it shapeshifts from like fear and understanding to different emotions as it's telling its story. And it almost reminds me of the Agent Smith from Matrix monologue about how humans are a virus, but we needed them to stay alive. He says essentially the same thing, where he's like, well, I don't know what right and wrong or evil is. I don't know what that is because I just create, and these people destroy themselves out of greed and lust and all those different things. And then he says that people have no consequence. We can always make more if we need them. I mean, the dark philosophical knowledge nuggets that this thing is dropping. And what's funny is I went to a Christian private school that showed us this. I don't think they watched that scene. I think they went to lunch or something or hung out in the teacher's lounge, because it's enough to make you not want to believe in a theology, because it really is stripping down the bare bones of like what humanity actually is and how it is essentially going to destroy itself in the future. I mean, we already kind of had that idea in the 80s. We talked about it all the time in the movies of, nuclear holocaust coming, The Day After, and Threads, and, Red Dawn even, that was going to happen on a larger scale. And here, this is almost like dramatized for kids. Really, really interesting stuff. And that's the segment that gets talked about the most from people. And they find it on YouTube. Of like, this was a kids movie, and we essentially just watched like the disintegration of a theology through a claymation figure.
Well, when we had that mask actually show anger, that's the pivotal moment that you're like, holy crap, that's terrifying.
Shit, yeah.
Yeah. But, well, I think the moment for me where this kind of clarifies who this was targeted for is when we actually get the topic of heaven and we have our character go into heaven. That's not really his type of heaven. Where
I'm glad you brought this up. Captain Stormfield. This is an amazing. This was a piece that I never really paid a lot of attention to as a kid, but I really pay attention to it now. So yeah, go ahead, because this is actually my favorite part of this movie now.
Mine too, because it is it's entertaining, but it gets that one last stinger at the end. Um, so where we have the character come in where he thinks he's going into his heaven, and they're asking these questions of where he's from, and a lot of follow-up questions of not misunderstanding, but multiple hints of different worlds, and it's a back and forth almost comedic conversation of where you're from. We'll just say California, or we'll just say the world,
The
and
world.
that's where our ego is, right? Is the world. There's many worlds. And then he gets let into what he thinks is his heaven. And it is just a drinking, eating, dancing party orgy
It's a
of
worm orgy. It's
yeah,
like these alien worms. They are, and they're not afraid of showing it. There are like same sex relationships going on. There's partying and drinking. There's loud music. Like you said, it is essentially an orgy of these crazy space worms. And when he pops out and he's like, you know what? I just realized something. Like, I begin to see that a man's got to be in his own heaven to be happy. Once again, that stinger of a line, but also the fact that it breaks down the idea of theology is so mind blowing to me that this was a movie made for kids. We were a lot more religious of a people back in the 70s and the 80s when kids would have been growing up and watching this stuff. And I would not be surprised if this is the film that made kids go, is there a God? Really? Because that's the brilliant part about that entrance into heaven scene is these worms are laughing at this human of like, oh, you think that you are like the prime species? Oh, you're from Earth? I think we had someone from Jupiter once, like it making it so insignificant to be a human in the grand scheme of things. Like again, that really knocks people down off their pedestal, which is what Mark Twain did with his stories. But to see it animated in a kids movie, like again, man, what the fuck?
well, it questions heaven, period, because when we get him going into his heaven, it is it's horrible. He has to follow direction. It's very stern. It hints that it's not even his heaven, where he might not even belong, because he goes into just a door full of darkness and coldness. The whole scene is set up where it just feels like I want to go back to the other place almost. So
Yeah.
it's almost a hint of where we practice and we preach religion, and is this the place you really want to end up, or is it going to be a continuous cycle of religion? When you get there, you'll be rewarded. How do we know? So there's a lot of question marks on that factor of it. So I mean, this one, I think the way they presented heaven on it, there's a certain intent of almost a cold shoulder to it.
Well, it's a cold shoulder, especially from Mark Twain to, I'm going to say, the more established Judeo Christian religions like Catholicism or Presbyterianism. The reason why I feel that way is because it's like whenever you go to, let's say, a Baptist church or a church that feels warm and welcoming and there's music and it seems like fun, yet there are some religions out there like, no, no, no. Church should be almost like a punishment. It should be cold and it should be quiet and you shouldn't smile. I mean, we talked about this in our Name of the Rose conversation on Back to the Balcony of like the idea of extreme religion and religious uh, religious I'm tired. The idea of being committed to God means you have to suffer and means you have to be miserable and not enjoy life or flavor or warmth or comfort. Like that's what I think Mark Twain is saying in that is like he even says it. I'll go to heaven for the climate, but I'll go to hell for the company because he knows that all the fun people that he wants to talk to aren't going to heaven.
Well, and that leads up to even the climax too, where you have the yin, the yang, the good, the bad,
The
the
duality.
balance.
Yeah.
Exactly. You have that balance where when you go into life, you have to have a proper balance, or else there is going to be no thrill. There is going to be no adventure. There is going to be no good, no bad. So it's a constant struggle. I mean, and when we get to that devil point, I think that's where the movie really takes off to really ask and discover those tough questions and really open up the mind, because there is layer upon layer of topics that we have to kind of discover for ourselves on what the right answer is. And Mark Twain, being the brilliant man that he is, there is no answer by the end of the movie. There is discovery of oneself. There is discovery that you have to make for yourself. He's not forcing propaganda down your throat. He is really just putting the question mark out there, and he's putting the what if out there. And that's what's so respectable about this movie is it just has a big question mark on where it wants to go and how it wants you to feel. Everybody's going to have a different opinion and a different thought process on this movie because of the fact it's just, like I said, a big question mark.
It's become a cult classic in the last 20 years, right? Lucky for us, it has a very flexible copyright. So it's on YouTube, it's on Tubi, it's on pretty much every streaming service. It's very easy to see now. But this was one of those things where it's like, I remember if I wanted to go to a video store to find it so I could show someone that it existed, it was really hard. I couldn't find it. You know, I had like a bootleg copy off of HBO or something for years, but if I didn't have it with me, I couldn't prove to people that this movie existed until YouTube and things like that started becoming more of a thing. And that's why I'm glad we're doing episodes like this because, for example, that movie Feliday, which I saw in a film studies class years ago and you'd never even heard of. No one knows about that movie because it never had a physical release, but over time, the internet keeps dropping these golden nuggets of forgotten, I'm not going to say disturbing, but because they weren't marketable like a Disney film is, right? They fell off the radar, and it's up to people like us to kind of pick them back up and get them back out there. Because this is one, I tell you, man, like this needs to be seen more by more people because it's the perfect time for it. In this time of like, let's say godlessness, if you're asking most religious people, I don't think it's a time of godlessness. I think it's people that have a lot more critical thinking in their brains. And this movie is made for critical thinkers.
Yeah. And this is one where it's not a one and done. So this one you have to
You
watch
got to
multiple
peel it.
times.
Yeah.
Yeah. This one has so much to it that you really do. And it's, I will be bold enough to say that this movie can even make you a little bit better when it comes to your thinking and make you a little bit better on your self-discovery on it. This is one of those rare movies that at first it's a little bit hard to warm up to for some. But once you get through it, it is an important movie and it's a beautiful movie to look at. And you will not find any claymation movie that does it better than this one. Just the scenery by itself and the attention to detail, it nails every technical aspect along with every piece of dialogue that really one would want from a movie to emotionally affect you after it's done. And this type of emotion is something we don't see anymore. Is the fact that it makes you think for hours on end.
It's not like Nightmare Before Christmas or Fantastic Mr. Fox. It's stop motion, but it doesn't have models. It doesn't have sets. Everything is made out of clay. Literally everything. Every building, every ship, all the clothes. Like there's no shortcuts on this movie. That's the part that to me is the most impressive, is that everything is literally made out of clay. And I honestly can't tell you another movie like I've seen like this that was made since then. I can't.
Well, even take it's rare that I would see a movie like this and say, how did they do that? But you even take that waterfall that he keeps going over and just seeing the
Yeah.
ripples in the thing. There's
It's
a lot
clay.
to this. Yeah, it's just clay, but the amount of detail and time that this must have taken. I mean, hats off to Will Vinton and the animators on this one. I mean, they did a fantastic job, and I wish they would have gotten more recognition and more box office dollars for this one.
Oh yeah, $1.5 million budget, and it only made 849,000. You know, and it's essentially open domain right now. Like anyone can show it, so they're not getting money off of this anymore. So, yeah, no, two really different animated films that we talked about tonight, both traumatic in their own ways, and you know, it's easy to go for the easy targets of, let's say, scary anime. Oh, those scared me. That was traumatic for me. Or the movies that will try and like get you with very strong sentimental moments. Bambi, Fox and the Hound, Land Before Time. Someone's got to die. Someone's mothers die. I think that these traumatized me as a kid in very different ways. With the Chipmunk Adventure, it's the fact that, yes, you are a child in peril all over the world, and your love for adventure clouds your judgment of actual danger. That's where that one traumatizes me for sure. And then this one, it's philosophy, it's nihilism, it's darkness, all given that cute coat of claymation paint where it deceives you into think you're watching something different, but you're not. That's what traumatizes me too. I mean, you could be 50 years old and watch the Mysterious Stranger segment and leave with a bad taste in your mouth. Like, what is my life now?
But yeah, two completely different movies, like you said, and each one you have, to me, the fear of the unknown, which is kind of my very simplistic takeaway from The Adventures of Mark Twain. And then again, a lot of things that people miss with the Chipmunk Adventure. That if you just pay attention to it, there's a lot of feelings that you might have felt during that movie, but you weren't sure why. But there are definitely elements in that one that just really resonate even more today than they probably did back in the 80s.
Yeah. Great conversation. I'm glad we talked about these two movies. I've already got a laundry list of Animation April episodes for next year. More traumatic tunes that we haven't talked about on either of our podcasts yet. So we can't use them on Back to the Balcony. Otherwise, we'll ruin them for this episode next year. But yeah, man, I'm glad that we had this conversation. And to all our listeners, please like, subscribe to my show, to Justin's show, The Movie Wire, and then the show that we run together, Back to the Balcony, which is our Siskel and Ebert retrospective. We are having a great time with that, and these are probably motion pictures that we talked about today that Siskel and Ebert might not have full reviews on. That's a good question. Did they?
Chipmunk Adventure, that one you need to look up because that one will make you angry. Adventures of Adventures of Mark Twain, they did not.
Yeah, I don't think it got like a very wide scale release for critics to actually look at it. I see a Video Hound review in here too, but it doesn't really say much. So yeah, it's just, these are the reasons why we do shows like this, to get you knowledgeable in these films that got made that did not get a lot of recognition in their time by critics or maybe parent groups that were like up in arms against it, but no one really giving the films their proper due.
100%. As long as there's no blood or swearing in animated movies, it's good to go in the 80s.
It's good to go, right? Okay, well, thanks, Justin, so much for this conversation. Everyone, like I said, make sure you subscribe to all of our shows. And if you've got any films you want to hear us talk about next year during Animation April, shoot me a message, shoot Justin a message, either on the Movie Wire or on the Cultworthy, or, just let us know on our YouTube. A lot of people are getting in touch on YouTube. So that's it for me. How about you?
That's it for me. Thanks again for having me on, and I'll see you on Back to the Balcony.
Yeah, I'll see you next week on Back to the Balcony. And everyone, I'll just see you later. Thank you for listening.